Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and to share a really important passion in my life and maybe inspire a few of you the way I was here at Stellafane many years ago. I've been to 52 Stellafanes now over the years, and I've received so many gifts, different types of gifts. I've made friends here, I've learned things, been inspired by the beautiful night sky, by craftsmanship, people that can fabricate precision optics, many different gifts that I've received from my interaction every year with Stellafane since I was a teenager. And one of the most important gifts was the gift of the passion for collecting old books. And it came during the Twilight Talks. It was actually 1975. It was my fourth Stellafane. And a gentleman by the name of Kenneth Brown spoke. And part of his talk revolved around collecting vintage astronomy books. And I just found it a curious, arcane, strange kind of hobby. But it was appealing. It resonated with me. And he mentioned a bookstore where he had gone to buy some of his books in Springfield, Mass., my hometown. So I got back home, and a few days later looked up that bookstore, and I was just enthralled by the books that I saw there. And it really inspired a lifelong interest thanks to a Twilight Talks presentation here, a keynote address back almost 50 years ago. Now, when I first went to those secondhand bookstores and found older books from the early 20th, late 19th century and older, it's hard to really identify what it is about what's appealing about different things that we collect, whether it's coins, baseball cards, what have you. There's many different characteristics, and I know early on I was just captivated by the archaic appearance of the books. You know, they didn't look anything like modern books. The illustrations were different, quaint woodcuts, engravings, beautiful tooled leather bindings and decorative bindings with artwork. And it really felt like it opened a window to a bygone era. I've always enjoyed history and the history of astronomy, and this was sort of a way to touch history, to handle and to look at these books, even though the theories may be outdated today, just to get an idea of what astronomy was like and what people believed in earlier days. So they were a tangible link to the past. Now, I've always been interested in the philosophy of value. How do things acquire value? What is value? I mean, there's a lot of different values that are associated with antiques and old books. And I've listed ones that came to mind. There's probably a few more. Some are more obvious than others, but value is not really a tangible thing. It resides in your mind. Everybody's sense of value is different. It's a combination of these different values that are listed here. But it translates mainly into money. How much is something worth? How much is it valued by other people? You know, what do you have to do to get a book? How rare is it? A book that's highly valued and is rare is very difficult to find. So it does affect your ability to acquire the books. But everybody has their own sense, and every object has its own combination of value. I like to use the Hannes Wagner baseball card as an indication of how something as mundane as a little piece of cardboard can acquire so much value, because baseball's popular, but it's also because of rarity. Well, there's a few theories about why there's so few of them, but they're extremely rare. And a little piece of cardboard in 2021 with Hannes Wagner's portrait sold for over $7 million, believe it or not. So you can look down the list and see the different types of values. Now, most of them are self-explanatory. Associative value might not be on the list, and that's basically the value that we give objects because they're connected to somebody else. And again, it's a mental manifestation, but it translates into physical value. For instance, on the Antique Roadshow once, I saw somebody had a chair that was used in the House of Representatives by John Quincy Adams, and they had owned it. And again, a chair is a chair, but because he sat in it for many, many years when he was a representative, suddenly it magically acquires this value. You know, if you have a telescope that Thomas Jefferson owned or a book, I mean, it would be worth a fortune because of who owned it. Now, collectors aren't generally interested in monetary value or investment or what have you, but sometimes it's good to know the value just in case you need to insure some of your possessions. Now, one of the values that I like to talk about is artistic value, and that's a major one that attracted me to old books. And here's a few examples from some of my books. Not just the illustrations inside, but even the covers had beautiful artwork. Like I said, beautiful leather bindings, marbled end papers, hand-colored illustrations. Back in the day when these were published, they couldn't do color printing, so they'd print that page and there'd be a room full of people actually watercoloring in the illustrations so that they'd be in color instead of black and white. So every copy is slightly different because of that. And then there's these beautiful chromolithographs like that one from the late 19th century. And it's just something that's I find appealing, and some people frame some of these objects. Unfortunately, it's led to the demise of some books where the value of the plates framed is worth more than the book itself, so they get guillotined and the pictures get framed, which is sad. But you know, if I find a damaged copy and extract a picture, it looks pretty good matted and framed. So, and another value is artistic values in graphic arts, because a lot of these old books, you know, from the 19th century and earlier are copyright free. So I've made T-shirts and coffee mugs and different things using woodcuts from old books, and they tend to print really nicely on objects like that. Here's some more interesting things from my collection that have artistic beauty. This astronomical diagrams is it's a very rare, but it's just so beautiful. And I bought this from an astronomy book specialist many years ago. And it contains 12 cards. They're loose cards, folio style inside a binding. They measure 9 by 11.5 inches. And a number of these cards have cutouts, and there's like a tissue paper glued to the back, painted so that you can hold them up to the light, and the light shines through them. And this series was created during the 1840s and 1850s by James Reynolds, who was a London publisher specialized in maps and charts and educational cards. So he did a bunch of these in different topics, one of which was astronomy, and they're just gorgeous. Here's an example of the moon plate. That's how it looks when you're just looking at it under a light, and this is backlit. The moon glowing in all its detail. And here's another example of a few other cards from that book. So, and again, hand painted, hand colored. Now, for associative value, I picked one of the treasures of my collection because it represents an intersection of two people that I met and really admired, who were instrumental in my development in astronomy: Carl Sagan and Fred Whipple. You all know Carl Sagan, of course. Fred Whipple from Harvard, the comet expert. This is a book written by Carl Sagan, one of his early books. Intelligent Life in the Universe, and 1966. But this came from the estate of Fred Whipple. After he died, a number of his books and different objects from his estate went on the auction block and were sold, and then dealers bought them and resold them on eBay and what have you. But this is one of his books, which has an inscription: "For Fred Whipple, with admiration and best wishes, Carl Sagan." So that's something, that's called a double association, or an association copy of a book, where it's a book that's linked to an esteemed or a famous individual, and a double association, it's given from one to another, usually from the author to another famous person. So it represents two different people, an interaction between two different people, and that's what makes it very desirable to collectors. Let's see, where did I put the, oh, here it is. Any of you heard of Elijah Burritt from New Britain, Connecticut? The geographer of the heavens. He's a good example of a person, an author that I collect and I have for decades because of his local interest value as well as artistic. As you can see, he did these beautiful star maps, but he was from Connecticut, so fairly local. And he was a very important popularizer of astronomy during the 19th century. As I said, he grew up in New Britain, Connecticut, and he published this beautiful large format star atlas called Geography of the Heavens, which appeared in 1833 and went through many different editions. And it was accompanied by a guidebook. And there was almost every year there was a new edition, long after Burritt had died. It was so popular. It was one of the best-selling astronomy books of the 19th century. But the guidebook is fairly common, but the atlas is much more difficult. It's so beautiful, and you know, it was a large format, so it didn't fit good onto bookshelves, so a lot of them were destroyed or tattered, or if they were used out under the stars at night. But I've seen them at the swap table here, and they're oftentimes framed, and they, again, hand-colored mythological figures. Each one is really a work of art. Now, Burritt didn't write too many books, but other than that atlas, which is fairly expensive, and the guidebook, which you can sometimes get for $20, the other books he wrote are very scarce because they're just not around for some reason. They didn't publish too many of them or what have you, but they were much more difficult to find, especially this one here, which was the latest one I found. And I actually searched for that book for about 20 years, Logarithmic Arithmetic. Burritt, when he was in college, calculated a table of logarithms more accurately than they were printed in other books at the time. And some teachers at the college imposed on him to publish it. So he wrote this book, Logarithmic Arithmetic, which describes all the uses of logarithms, gives the tables of logarithms that he had calculated. But it also has an extensive 64-page section on astronomical calculations, mainly eclipse calculations. And the book was published in 1818 in a small print shop in Williamsburg, Massachusetts. A little local print shop, so there's typos and different little errors throughout the book, but as far as I know, it was the only edition ever printed. And this beautiful fold-out illustration of eclipses is the only plate in the book, and oftentimes that plate will be missing. Over the years, I've only seen 3 copies. One I bought, and when it was sent to me, this plate was gone, so I sent it back. Another one, they advertised that the plate was half missing. But then I found this copy after looking for years and years, and the plate was just pristine. And to think that that was written and published while he was in college, found the time to do that. He was quite a person. And then he wrote this book, Universal Multipliers, in 1830, which focused on calculation of simple and compound interest. And it was very useful in business, so it had a pretty large demand when it was published in Hartford. And he eventually, it got so much notoriety that he was able to sell the copyright to it to a publisher in New York City and made a sizable sum of money, including a percentage of profits from future editions. So I believe what he got was like in today's dollars, like a couple of $100,000. And it helped him build a school in New Britain, Connecticut. It helped give him the time and money to write Geography of the Heavens, the star map and guidebook, which was the most important thing that he wrote during his lifetime. Now, Burritt died tragically at a young age. He died of yellow fever in 1838. It's only 5 years after these publications came out. He was only 43 years old. And it turns out that he was convinced to help lead a group of settlers to Texas, which was an independent republic at the time, to start a business. So he brought a group of machinists and different artisans to, they were establishing the town of Houston at the time, and he was to help out and start this business. And so he brought the group down there, and there was a hurricane that came by just when they arrived. There was nowhere for them to stay except tents, and there was an outbreak of yellow fever, and he died as well as a portion of the group that he was leading. So he died at a young age, but his book remained in print for decades after that. Very, very popular. So where does one go to collect, to find books to collect? That's always a big question. And of course, secondhand bookstores. Most towns and cities have at least one or two secondhand bookstores. In the beginning, that's where I used to go looking around for books, but eventually you realize, there are exceptions, but mainly what you're going to find are more recent books that are outdated and not new, so they have them there from the 50s and 1960s and 40s, and you don't really find any really early books or really rare books. But there's always exceptions to that. Antiquarian bookshops are bookshops that cater to collectors more. They have older things, more expensive things. Oftentimes, an antiquarian book dealer will specialize in a certain subject, like a friend of mine, Paul Luther, who specialized in antique astronomy books. And then, of course, there's flea markets, antiquarian book fairs, and auctions, which are advertised from time to time. Even the Stellafane swap table here, I found some pretty cool things over the years. And, of course, the internet. Oh, I can't really see the hand on this. Is this running? I can't tell how much time is gone. Okay. I don't want to go over time. I get excited about books. I could talk for a couple of hours. But book fairs, like you see on the bottom, are kind of cool because dealers will generally bring their best items to show off because they have to pack them up and cart them to a school or a library or an auditorium somewhere, and there might be like 50 or 100 dealers go from one to another and say, you got any books on telescope making or what have you, and you never know what they're going to pull out. There, of course, the swap table at the upper left with Dennis DeChico looking at books, and he's a big avid book collector. Now, not long after I was inspired to delve into the arcane hobby of antique book collecting here at Stellafane, I saw a little ad in Sky and Telescope for a gentleman named Paul Luther, who was an antiquarian astronomy book specialist. And I was so lucky to notice that he actually lived within a fairly short drive from my home. So he lived for about a 40-minute drive from my home. So for decades, I purchased captivating old books from his catalogs. He issued catalogs every couple of months, every few months, and I made periodic trips to his home where he had his basement outfitted like a library of bookshelves and all these amazing rare books. I'd estimate that probably 25% of the items in my collection came from Paul over the years. But the most important acquisitions from him were the mentorship, the encouragement, the personalized service, and the friendship that comes with dealing with an expert, an actual person, as opposed to a website or a computer screen. And he retired back in 2013, partly due to the pressures exerted by the internet. The landscape changed quickly at the time. Now, this is an example of a lesson that I learned, that treasures can be found in the unlikeliest of places. One day back in 1974, I was walking past a trash dumpster, of all things, and I noticed something in there with a NASA logo on it. So that piqued my interest, and I walked over, and I rescued a pristine original copy of the Apollo 11 lunar landing mission press kit, which was a 250-page document, as a book-sized document that was distributed to the media by NASA about 2 weeks before Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, to give them all the information for the newspaper. And it's been reproduced a number of times on the different anniversaries over the years. But it's just fascinating. What was temporarily a piece of trash in a dumpster has occupied a place of honor in my library for over half a century. Now, like all book collectors, I buy on the internet too. It's made life really easy, but it's changed the landscape, the dynamics of book collecting, for better and for worse. Websites like ABE Books, A-Libris, Biblio, and others enable a collector from the comforts of home to rummage through tens of millions of books offered by dealers from all over the world. A collector can readily find a rare book or a rare astronomy item that back in the day would have required years of searching or the assistance of a book specialist. With many books being scanned and made available on the internet, the informational value of the physical volumes to researchers and libraries has gradually eroded, causing the specialist market to shrink even more. Some libraries bought old books because of the information that you couldn't get anywhere else, but now they're all on the internet. So little by little, the market for specialist dealers has shrunk, which is why Paul and others have gone out of business. So in short, the world of old astronomy books has become easier to navigate, but at the expense of depersonalization and the loss of the tremendous value derived from the collector-specialist relationship. Purchasing books for your collection on the internet comes with an element of risk, because you're purchasing an item that you haven't personally examined, usually from a stranger who may or may not have bookselling experience. In addition, the item must survive a potentially hazardous journey through the postal system. To mitigate these risks, before each purchase, you should ask yourself a few questions. Is the seller an established book dealer? You'd have more confidence if they were. For eBay, does the seller have lots of sales with 100% positive? Now, if a dealer sold thousands of books, there's always somebody that's going to gripe about something and give them a negative feedback. But if 10% or 5% are negative, that's something to be concerned about. Does the seller's description tell you exactly what you're purchasing, including publication date, edition, type of binding, and most important of all, condition? Are there photos, especially ones that depict any defects in the volume? For the most part, you can trust professional book dealers, but some novice or unscrupulous sellers will try to spin their descriptions because they're eager to make a sale. So you might see something in a description like "in good condition for its age," whatever that means. And the one I love, I've seen this a few times, is something similar to this. You know, you read loose covers, edge wear, some writing inside, otherwise very good condition. That's not very good condition. Before purchasing old books sight unseen, you should become familiar with the lexicon of old books and book defects so that you know what to expect when a book is said to have shelf wear, weak hinges, a chipped spine, foxing, or is ex-library. And there's a number of antiquarian book glossaries that you can find on the internet easy enough. On rare occasions, even a professional dealer can overlook something like an illustration that's been carefully cut out and you don't realize it's missing. But they will always offer a money-back guarantee if a defect is inadvertently overlooked. Packaging is another major concern when you're into collecting old books because, as I said, they must navigate the postal system, and that's not always a good experience for old books if they're not packaged right, especially people that just put something in an envelope or a bubble, one of those bubble envelopes that offers virtually no protection. This is a kind of a cool satellite pathfinder that I bought a number of years ago. And here's how it arrived with this big black gash. I don't know what, looks like it was put on a grinding wheel or something, but it came, carried through to the object. Not, it could have been worse, but it's still an unsightly blemish because it was packaged so poorly. And again, that comes from a seller being a novice and not really knowing how to package an old book like that. So I always request, please package securely using cardboard. And most dealers will do that, but it never hurts to say that. And especially the corners of books are vulnerable. So even if a book is in a box, if there's no gap between the book and the box itself, if it gets dropped on the corner, there's nothing worse than getting a book in fine condition that's 150 years old, and over the past week it got its corner crushed after surviving that long because somebody dropped it in the post office. So you have like a box inside a box with some kind of peanuts or bubble wrap around it. That's the best way to protect a book through the mail. So it doesn't hurt to ask for that. Now, what's the story with first editions? I think most people, when they think about book collecting, first editions, that's like the ultimate goal in book collecting. And it is important for some reasons. It's not super important, but a first edition is desirable because it might represent the author's earliest published version of a work. So it shows you his early thoughts, and then the book evolves. You get feedback between volumes, make corrections, expand it, what have you. I say it might be the first appearance because in some cases, like Garrett Serviss with his Astronomy with an Opera Glass, pretty famous book from the late 1800s, appeared serialized in the newspaper first. So the newspaper version's actually the first edition, but then there'd be a first book edition afterwards. It's also likely that a first edition will have a much smaller print run than subsequent editions because they're feeling out the market. How well will this sell? Well, we'll take a chance and publish 500 copies. And then if they sell out right away, then they might publish 5,000 copies. But that first 500 copy edition will be very rare. So again, rarity is desirable and translates into a higher price tag. And you can't discount the simple emphasis that people nowadays place on being first. It's a psychological thing. In this picture is a scarce 1926 first edition of the famous book that grew out of a collaboration between Russell Porter and Albert Ingalls, Amateur Telescope Making. This particular copy is even more rare because it includes a very ephemeral dust jacket, which are often missing from old books. And this is the first edition here, which I bought at a book fair from my buddy Paul Luther, who had bought it from a dealer and had it for about an hour, and then I snatched it from him before somebody else got it. And boy, am I glad I did, because I've never seen another copy with a dust jacket. But that's the Bible of telescope making, and it grew out of Stellafane and Russell Porter, and now it's a 3-volume set. But early on it was a single volume, and the first edition, and this is very easy to identify. Look how thin it is compared to the latter editions. The first edition was only 102 pages with a print run of 3,400 because they had generated interest in the pages of Scientific American, and so they were comfortable doing 3,400, and they sold out really fast. And then the second edition that appeared 2 years later, which is this one here, the page count jumped to 285 pages, so there's quite a difference between those two editions. Now, identification of first editions could be an entire talk. I mean, oftentimes, if the date on the copyright page and the title page matches, it's a first edition. Some books actually say first edition, but sometimes if a book is published more than once in the same year, the two dates might match, but it might be a second edition, so it's hard to tell. There are references that tell you how different publishers identify first edition, but for some collectors, that's an important thing. As they become more experienced, many book collectors will gradually focus on one or more specific themes within the myriad topics that constitute astronomy. Some themes might include telescope making, eclipses, amateur astronomy, women in astronomy, star and moon atlases, astronomical photography, children's books about the universe, local astronomy, specific authors. But the bottom line, as I always tell people, is collect whatever makes you happy. Don't collect what somebody tells you to, just collect what you like. Many antiquarian astronomy book enthusiasts also collect astro ephemera and memorabilia. Ephemera, as the word implies, are printed items meant to be used for a short time and then discarded, like a ticket to a concert, the ticket stub, that's ephemera. Memorabilia, on the other hand, are printed non-book items created with the expectation that they will be saved. Examples of ephemera and memorabilia include old postcards, photographs, newspapers, telescope catalogs, Stellafane announcement flyers, and the list goes on and on. I personally enjoy collecting letters written by famous astronomers as well as astronomical postcards from the early 20th century and 19th century. You can also include planispheres into that group. Planispheres are very fascinating, and there are lots of different early versions that you can collect, kind of rare. If you used to be a baseball card collector as a kid, there's a lot of card-type objects in the world of astronomy, like postcards. These cards were initially cigarette cards back in the day. That's what the Hannes Wagner card was, a cigarette card that came in packs of cigarettes. And then eventually they would put them in boxes of tea and different things like that, just as a little added incentive to get people to buy them. And these are all like early 20th century and mid-20th century, and some nice lithography. There's the Porter turret telescope and an old postcard, and there's a card that was used as a Christmas card by John Pierce, one of the founders of Stellafane, and it shows Stellafane, early photo without the turret scope, believe it or not. But when they made the postcard, they flipped the negative around. The printer didn't know what Stellafane looked like, and he printed it backwards, but you can easily reverse it on your computer, and it's a great early look at Stellafane without the Porter turret scope. After many years of collecting, I gradually came to understand that I don't really own the old books in my collection. I prefer to think of myself as a custodian who has the privilege of accompanying and cherishing my books during a portion of their lives. Many longtime collectors own vintage items that have historical importance, and with that privilege comes the ethical responsibility of assuring that these items survive into the future. There are some simple precautions that will protect a cherished collectible from unnecessary damage and deterioration. Books should always be stored vertically and snugly in bookcases, but not so tight that it's hard to extract a volume. You shouldn't allow books to slump over because that can distort their bindings. Make sure you don't let sunlight shine through your window on the spines because it can bleach them out. Sunlight is a bleaching agent that can ruin old books. And they're best kept in a room that's dark, cool, and low humidity, but not too low. That's a portion of my library. Humidity is extremely important for any paper items. It's a threat because high humidity can promote the growth of mold, which can permanently stain something. Low humidity can make things brittle, especially bindings. So ideally, a library should be between 45 and 55% humidity, so somewhere in that 10% range. Attics and basements are generally unsuitable unless they're climate controlled. And obviously store your books away from pets as well as sources of airborne contamination such as fireplaces, wood stoves, kitchen, and also the dirty fingers of little kids running around interested in your books. Old books and related items benefit from the use of acid and lignin-free protective materials such as dust jacket covers, postcard pages, boxes, tape, and they sell preservatives for old leather bindings to keep them supple so they don't crack. These items can be purchased at archival supply outlets such as University Products in Holyoke, Mass. How much time do I have left?
About 15 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to speed up here. So I'm going to quickly go through some items that relate more to astronomy and telescope making and Stellafane itself. Here's an old Popular Science that I found a while back that has a cool article about the Harkness Turret Telescope. Let's see. That was from 1924. And of course, that's a 10-inch Brashear lens in that famous telescope down at the Harkness House. And they had a nice cutaway view underground and above ground that spanned 2 pages, and I was able to stitch it together to get it into one illustration showing how it looked back in 1924. That's where the museum is currently located today. I found this really cool article that by Harkness himself, a 44-page transcript of a lecture that he presented at the 1911 meeting of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. So this was published in 1912. And again, a nice cross-sectional view along with a picture of how that turret scope looks. If you haven't seen it, please get down there in downtown Springfield and see that. Here's another turret scope. There are very few turret telescopes in the world, but I found a postcard of Bonneview Observatory, which no longer exists. But a guy named Webster came up to Stellafane in 1930, and he went to the Harkness House, and he got inspired, and he made himself a 5-inch turret telescope. Here's the Boston telescope, man. If you go down to the History Museum at the Harkness House in the subterranean rooms, you'll see this tube hanging from the ceiling, and that was the telescope of a guy that used to set up in the vicinity of Boston Common and charge people a nickel or a dime to look through his telescope. And I've always been fascinated by that. John Briggs donated that to the museum a number of years ago. But what I found on the internet was this glass photograph, and when I looked carefully, I could see a telescope, and lo and behold, it's that telescope from a glass photograph taken in 1897. It was used to create a postcard, and it depicts Boston's Park Street subway station. And what's fascinating is Russell Porter, who was a student at MIT at the time, was inspired by crossing paths with the Boston telescope man, looking through the telescope. And he wrote, there's a quote from him, "It was the old man with his 5 cents a look telescope standing at Brimstone Corner on the edge of Boston Common some 20-odd years ago that created in me the desire to possess for myself a telescope big enough to spread the marvels of the heavens before my eyes. And that's right at the spot where it was when Porter saw it, and right around the time frame. So I don't think Porter's in that group of people, but you never know. There's an old stereo view card of the Boston telescope man that I bought from a dealer in England. A price list from John Pierce up here at Stellafane, and this one has a nice letter written by him at the bottom and encouraging somebody about this very fascinating hobby. Dated 1928, John Pierce created telescope making kits for the people that came here or read the articles in Scientific American. They could make their own telescopes. Here's a nice brochure of Russell Porter's garden telescope, which is extremely rare, and you're very proud and lucky if you own one, but you can at least get a copy of the brochure that Jones and Lamson created to promote it. Beautiful artwork. When I first started coming to Stellafane, there was a gentleman named George Keene that I became sort of a groupie and went to all of his talks. He was a luminary up here, and he worked for Eastman Kodak, wrote Stargazing with Telescope and Camera, which was one of the first astronomy books I ever bought. He finally retired, and he disappeared from Stellafane, and later I found out that he retired and moved out to Oregon, and he started a business making camera obscuras. And so I finally, in 1999, I wrote to him and said, you know, I always loved your talks. I always wanted to get your book autographed. Would you please autograph this copy and send it back to me? And I sent him a return envelope and all that. And I got the book back with this nice inscription, as well as a long letter telling me he grew up in my hometown, Springfield, Mass., which I'd never dreamed. But George Keene received a lot of notoriety when his picture of the 1979 eclipse appeared on the front cover of Life magazine. And he was a prominent telescope maker and photographer and all that, but this has taken it up another notch. And one day I'm looking at the date on here, and he had my book for like 2 or 3 months, and I thought I was never going to get it back, and then finally it came back, and it was like a year or so before I realized that he signed it on the 30th anniversary of that eclipse. He must have done that on purpose. He held it until that day and then signed it and sent it back to me. I was really tickled when I saw that. Here's an example of some things you can collect if you love astronomy and you love old stuff, old books and publications. These are telescope catalogs, and you can find dozens of these for Sputnik watchers. A little cultural significance. Here's an Alvin Clark flyer for telescopes. This one very similar to the one at the 8-inch Clark at Mount Holyoke College. Now this is an interesting book because it was one of the books used by Russell Porter early on when he was getting into telescope making. 1899, it has a chapter titled Handworking of Telescope Specula. I purchased that from a dealer, believe it or not, in Auckland, New Zealand. Here's another book that Russell Porter used, The Amateur's Telescope, 1920. Portion of this was reprinted in the first edition of ATM, the Amateur Telescope Making, by Reverend William Ellison from Northern Ireland, Armagh Observatory. This Smithsonian publication has a couple of important articles on the construction of a silvered glass telescope. This was a book that Warner and Swasey published to promote their beautiful instruments. They made mostly massive mountings, but they also made complete telescopes. And this was published in 1900. Now this is a little softcover book, The Homemade Telescope, 1935. I just love that picture in it. That illustration is so cool. That typifies the amateur telescope making of the early 20th century. A book by John Dobson, the Dobsonian named after him, and bound in plywood because you use plywood to build a Dobsonian. 1991, they go for $200 to $300 because they weren't published in that great a number and because of the novelty of a wooden binding. On the adjustment of telescope objectives, this is a pretty important book, 1891 by Harold Dennis Taylor, who was the optical manager at the telescope making firm of T. Cook and Sons, and it has a tipped-in actual photograph showing star testing results of different defects in a lens. And I was told this book is worth its weight in gold by the guy that sold it to me. Frank's Book of the Telescope. And I found up at the swap table a first edition of Jean Texero's book, How to Make a Telescope. The French language edition is the first edition. I almost didn't buy it. He wanted $150, softcover book. Should I spend that much? And after a while he said, how about if I chop the one off? I said, sold. And that's the second and third edition on the right there. All right, I know time's running short. I want to conclude. Hopefully I've got 10 minutes left because this will take about 10 minutes. But I'd like to tell you a story that epitomizes the reason why I love old books. And it's a story about a book that I purchased a number of years ago. Let me see here. Okay. Got my notes mixed up here. Okay, here we go. I have a lot of stories that I could tell, but I'll just tell this one to conclude the talk. And it combines my passions for historical astronomy as well as the history of the Revolutionary War. And it involves a remarkable book that I purchased several decades ago from a secondhand bookshop, which oddly enough was located in the basement of a restaurant, called System of Newtonian Philosophy, Astronomy, and Geography, published in 1771 by Benjamin Martin, who sold spectacles and scientific instruments at his shop on Fleet Street in London. So here's all these mundane, recent old books on this secondhand bookstore shelf, and here's a leather-bound book. I couldn't believe it, 1771. That's almost unheard of. And inside the book are all these magnificent fold-out illustrations of optical instruments and microscopes and telescopes and whatever that new solar microscope is on the upper left, but cool illustrations, and that would have made it worthwhile itself. But then when I looked at the front end paper, which is the blank page right under the cover, there's this magnificent inscription, John Porter's book, 1776, William Edmonds' book, 1776. And that really electrified my imagination. What an iconic year to be alive. I've always been intrigued by the old ownership names and inscriptions that can be found in many of my vintage astronomy books. They serve as reminders that the items in my collection were once read and cherished by a multitude of people, most of whom have faded into history. These names are like faint whispers echoing through time, prodding me to conduct research, to resurrect their memories. And so over the years, I periodically attempted to uncover some information about John Porter and William Edmond. The book was published in London, so I focused my attention there, but I always came up empty. A few years ago, I tried again. This time I conducted a careful page-by-page examination of the book and found something that I had previously not noticed, the name of a third owner, Ebenezer Huntington, which was lightly stamped on two interior pages, right here and here. And that became the key to solving the mystery of who the owners of this book were. When I added his name to the mix, it quickly revealed that the nexus of these three individuals was not London, but Yale College in Connecticut, which would become Yale University in 1887. It turns out that Porter, Edmonds, and Huntington were students at Yale, and all three of them fought in the Revolutionary War. John Porter graduated in 1776. He worked as a clerk for Connecticut Governor Jonathan Trumbull, and in 1779 he joined the 9th Connecticut Regiment and later became comptroller of the state of Connecticut. He handled the budget for the state. He died at a young age, 49 years old, of consumption, which is now called tuberculosis. William Edmund graduated from Yale in 1778 and went on to practice law in Newtown, Connecticut. If we have any Connecticut people here, I'm going to regale you with a little Connecticut history. During the spring of 1777, following a British raid on the Continental Army Supply Depot in Danbury, Connecticut, Edmund joined 500 Connecticut militiamen in an attempt to block the Redcoats' retreat to their getaway boats, which were docked on Long Island Sound. Led by Benedict Arnold, the militia made a stand along the main road through Ridgefield, Connecticut, but they were no match for the British regulars. During the Battle of Ridgefield, a musket ball slammed into William Edmund's leg. The guy that owned this book was wounded in the leg by a musket ball and was rescued the next day, but the painful wound failed to heal properly. A doctor examined him and gave him the bad news that his leg would need to be amputated. But since it was the Sabbath, the doctor left behind his surgical instruments and agreed to return the next day to perform the dreaded operation. On Monday morning, the doctor was shocked to discover that William Edmund had used those instruments to open the wound himself, and he ordered the doctor to just remove the musket ball, remove the bone fragments, clean it, and bandage it up, but leave my leg alone. He ended up surviving with both legs firmly attached, although he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. And years later, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he became a good friend of President John Adams. Isn't it amazing how research is bringing these people back to life? And I must have put 200 hours of research into this story to uncover this information, but it was worth it. The third person that had stamped his name, Ebenezer Huntington, was a member of a prominent Connecticut family, and he was the most interesting of the three people who once owned this old astronomy book. As the flowers were blooming in the spring of 1775, Huntington's thoughts were focused on his upcoming graduation from Yale. But then, like a coronal mass ejection, the alarm raced across New England that the British had engaged Massachusetts militiamen at Lexington and Concord. 2 days after the shot heard round the world, Huntington answered the call. He violated Yale's rules by leaving without permission to go enlist, and soon he was part of the rebel force that was keeping the British soldiers bottled up in Boston, where they had fled after Lexington and Concord. Despite the fact that a narrow strip of land called Boston Neck was all that separated the two sides, Huntington was also worried about damage control at Yale. He wrote to his father asking him to determine whether he could receive his degree in absentia. When Harvard President Samuel Langdon heard about Huntington's dilemma, he offered to award him a degree from Harvard if Yale refused to do so. Remember, he's up in Roxbury fighting the British who were bottled up, so he wasn't far from Harvard. And as it turned out, Huntington received degrees from both colleges. After the siege of Boston, Captain Huntington was part of General George Washington's disastrous Long Island campaign, which ended with the Continental Army's miraculous nighttime evacuation across the East River into Manhattan. Huntington had risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel and commanded a light infantry unit during the siege of Yorktown. As an aide to General Benjamin Lincoln, who was Washington's second in command, Huntington participated in the formal surrender ceremony of Lord Cornwallis's army, which essentially brought the war to a close. Huntington is actually depicted in the famous painting of Cornwallis's surrender by John Trumbull that hangs in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. Years later, he was promoted to brigadier general and served as a U.S. congressman. So imagine, who would have thought that after 2.5 centuries, three fading names written inside an old astronomy book would unlock this captivating story of a trio of college students and their exploits during the American Revolution. And it just makes me wonder what other stories remain hidden. There's names in many old books that I have, and it takes a while sometimes to do the research, but boy, is it rewarding. So I encourage you, all of you, to think about that and try to bring some people back to life who are long forgotten. And the last slide, if you're interested in old books, I have a vintage astronomy book group on Facebook called Vintage Astronomy Books, which you're welcome to check out. We got a couple of thousand members. I've got business cards up in front that give the link to that, as well as my email address. So if you'd like to take one and check it out, you're more than welcome. Thank you very much.
Sure, there may be many questions, but I think in order to proceed with the talks sort of on schedule, I had better invite Richard to be available. Are you going to be around for a while?
Sure, yeah, I'm going to watch Phil's talks.
So hang around with him in the back, and we'll get Helen Slisky started pretty soon.
Who's up? Phil Harrington.
Oh, Harrington first. Yes, Harrington first and then Slisky. So in order to keep these things going, perhaps I better thank you all. And I'm glad the people gathered like this, because that was fascinating. Thank you.
And you're up for a real treat next, so don't leave.
Yeah.
Phil Harrington does an awesome talk, and enjoy Stellafane, everyone.